Afternoon. My name is Astrid Maswar, and I want to welcome you to the NIH Office of Disease Prevention's Methods Mind the Gap webinar series. This webinar will cover approaches to behavioral mHealth inventions using control systems engineering. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping items. You can submit questions during the webinar by clicking on the question mark in the WebEx toolbar. Please direct your questions to all panelists. We will open the floor to questions that have been submitted via WebEx at the conclusion of today's talk. The slides and video recording will be posted on our website, prevention.nih.gov/mindthegap, in approximately 1 week. You will receive an email when they are available. Lastly, we would appreciate your feedback about today's webinar. Upon closing the WebEx meeting, you will be prompted to complete the evaluation. We would appreciate your feedback as it will help us improve this webinar series. Today's speaker is Dr. Daniel E. Rivera. Dr. Rivera is a professor of chemical engineering in the School for Engineering of Matter, Transport, and Energy at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. He received a BS degree in chemical engineering from University of Rochester, an MS degree in chemical engineering from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD in chemical engineering from California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, California. Prior to joining Arizona State University, he was a member of the Control Systems section of Shell Development Company in Houston, Texas. His research interests span the topics of dynamic modeling using system identification, robust process control, and applications of control engineering to problems in supply chain management and behavioral medicine. In 2007, he received a Mentored Quantitative Research Career Development Award from the National Institute on Drug Abuse to examine how dynamical systems and control engineering approaches can be used to optimize interventions for the prevention and treatment of drug abuse. He was named a distinguished member of the IEEE Control Systems Society in 2019 and is a 2020 recipient of the David Himmelblau Award for Innovations in Computer-Based Chemical Engineering Education from the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Rivera.
Hello?
Yes, Dr. Rivera, we're ready for you.
I am not getting any audio.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm not getting any audio. I apologize for the technical issue. Okay.
Let's have you stop sharing and start sharing again.
Hi.
You can hear us now?
Can I get an acknowledgement that I'm being heard? Because I'll just go ahead and continue. Okay, I'm sorry. I did not hear my my introduction from David Murray, but would like to thank the NIH Office for Disease Prevention for the opportunity to be able to give this this webinar. And what I want to talk to you today is about work that we've done in my lab and with my collaborators on optimizing mHealth interventions using control systems engineering. And I want to focus on the what we call the control optimization trial. Okay, now I am a faculty member at Arizona State University in the Fulton Schools of Engineering. I am assuming that that was mentioned during the introduction. And what I'd like to do is basically this last year in June of 2019, Eric Hekler, who's a friend collaborator, gave a talk on control systems engineering. And so I would like to, in a way, complement what he did. His talk is available on the NIH website. And So I would like to call attention to it. And basically, want to be able to show how control systems engineering can be used to develop interventions that are personalized, that are adaptive in the sense that they are time varying and that are optimized. Okay, and coupled with control systems engineering is an ancillary field called system identification, which allows us to get dynamical models. And then we're going to rely on behavior change theories as a way of informing this process. Okay, and then the control optimization trial is a term that Eric and I have coined as a way of being able to achieve these interventions. Now, a couple of caveats associated with my talk. First of all, I want to make clear that I am an engineer, not a computer scientist. I'm not a statistician. I'm a chemical engineer who, for the last 15 or so years or so, have been working in this area. So you will see that a lot of engineering sensibilities will feature prominently in this talk. Okay. The other caveat that I'd like to make is that the approaches that I'm going to present are going to be idiographic, single subject in nature, and for some of the work that we're doing currently with the COT, we will have a clinical trial, a randomized clinical trial, and the like. But pretty much all the results that I will show will be based on single subject kind of approaches. And then last but not least, the fact that just recognize that this is still work under development. In fact, for most of the presentation, I will actually be showing results involving real data. And then towards the end, I will show some simulations and some of the aspirational goals and some of the things that we hope to be able to do in our current projects. Okay. Now, because the time can go fast, I'd like to call attention to some number of references that can be very useful that you can look at after this seminar is over. Okay, and one of them is a paper that we wrote on JMIR, which is accessible pretty much to anyone. And then the second is a chapter in a book, in an edited series by Linda Collins and Carrie Kugler on MOST, and we do have a chapter that we written for that text. And depending on the Springer Link subscription that you might have at your institution, you may already have access to this book, and you can look at that chapter. There's also a series of references, helpful recent references. And again, this talk will be available on the NIH Office for Disease Prevention webinars website, and you can have a closer look at these. And among the references here is the link to Eric Hekler's webinar from last year. Okay, so let me also, because time is short, make some acknowledgements. I've mentioned Eric Hekler, who was here at ASU as a faculty member for a number of years. He's now at the University of California, San Diego, where he has a number of responsibilities. And in fact, a lot of the work that we've done with respect to formulating the COT was done as part of an NSF project. And we currently have an R01 that just got started this summer on July 14th. And there's a larger team at UCSD that's engaged in that. The photo to your right is a photo of our NSF team, what we call the Just Walk Modeling and More team. Okay, back in 2016. Okay, and also would like to acknowledge Daniel Downs and Jennifer Savage Williams from Penn State University, and they are also co-authors of the chapter that I mentioned in the most edited book. And they were also Daniel Downs, the PI, and Jennifer, a co-investigator in an R01 that led to the Healthy Mom Zone, which is one of the studies that I will discuss as part of this talk. Okay, so basically what we want to have is personalized interventions that are also perpetually adapting in the sense that they keep participants engaged over time. Okay, and as you can see from this cartoon, Being able to personalize interventions involves recognizing individual differences that could occur across participants and also over time, being able to recognize these differences. Okay, and let me give you some examples of different problems that would require aspects of personalization and also some adaptation, time-varying adaptation over time. This here shows a plot of responses for participant weight gain in our Healthy Moms Home study, which is geared towards managing gestational weight gain in women that are pregnant women that are obese or overweight. And what you can see here from looking at these daily weight trends is that you get what we call in dynamical systems integrating responses. Okay, and you can see that depending on whether the participant, it's intervention participant control, they are either within or outside of Institute of Medicine guidelines. But clearly here we have change over time, change that follows a very structured pattern that we call an integrating system. And then there's going to be opportunities for personalizing this intervention to allow the participants to be able to respond and hopefully be within the targets. This second example here comes from work done by David Conroy and Constantino Lagoa and their team at Penn State University. David Conroy is a kinesiologist. Constantino Lagoa is an electrical engineer, control engineer like me. Although I happen to be in chemical engineering, he's an electrical engineer, and they've looked into using text messages to promote physical activity. And what I want you to note here that for this particular participant, you can see that the responses that you get follow a certain dynamic pattern, what we call overdamped in dynamical systems. And it varies whether it's a weekday or weekend, and it also depends on the nature of the text message provided. Okay, so there's reasons here why we would want to take advantage of these dynamic characteristics and take advantage of this heterogeneity of response to be able to deliver a personalized, time-varying, optimized intervention. And then last but not least, I have here data from smoking cessation intervention. This was data that we received access from the University of Wisconsin Center for Tobacco Research and Intervention. And here shows two different participants, one that received a drug, which was bupropion in counseling, and then a placebo participant. And what I want you to pay particular attention is to the craving response, particularly what's happening with the intervention participant, because you have here, after a baseline period when the quit is introduced, you have this increase in craving followed by an eventual decrease. And this kind of response is what we call in dynamical systems an inverse response. And again, we have intensive data, differentiation or response between intervention and placebo and control, characteristics that could be potentially optimized over time. So again, in summary, we have this lag dynamical behavior that we can recognize in the control engineering world. We have outcome variables that can be, and other variables that can be measured intensively. We have, and I will go when I show the particular examples that we worked on, multiple intervention options and frequent decision points available. And then also something that is important to consider is that we have theory and evidence that prior knowledge about the intervention that we can think in terms of how and not so much if. So if you're dealing with a brand new intervention where it's not clear that it's going to have effects, significant effects and the like, then maybe this is not the approach that you should consider. We're going to tap on a fair amount of prior knowledge and prior understanding as part of this approach. Now, control systems engineering in general is a widely applicable field. It's part of many consumer products and many, you know, it's an important, it's seen in automobiles, it's seen in homes, it's the artificial pancreas is a closed system. And so it's very ubiquitous, and many times it's under the hood. It doesn't make itself known in a very overt way. And what we want to do is we recognize that systems have dynamical behavior that changes over time, and we want to be able to move it from undesirable responses to desirable. Okay, and I have here a link to the IEEE Control Systems Society website that has all sorts of success stories and grand challenges for the control field. Now, this general picture, this also introduces some nomenclature that we use in this field. When something is before the control gets implemented, we talk about it as being in the open loop. And then when we commission the controller, we close the loop. And this transfer of variance is critical to what a control system, a good control system does. So you basically have an output of interest, an outcome of interest that is varying in a way that's undesirable. When you turn on the controller, then what happens is that to get uniformity in the variable of interest, then something is manipulated, whether it be flow rate, daily goals, some other intervention component, something gets manipulated, which basically absorbs the variability that you don't want to see in the outcome of importance. So this transfer of variance from the controlled variable to the manipulated variable, so as a result of the closed system, is critical to what a control system does. And this will be evident in some of the things that I will show as further illustrations of the control engineering approach and the COT in particular. This little movie here I borrowed from Eric, and I guess this is the family boat, right? And this right now is, in fact, one hint that you have something that has a control system on it is if it's in auto mode, if it's in auto or automatic mode. So in this case, this has a fixed waypoint, and this boat is trying to navigate in a desired path. And in order to maintain uniformity to achieve that path, you can notice that the ship's wheel is moving to make the adjustments needed to maintain that uniformity. Okay, so two important parts to the control engineering approach, and again, in this way, this is distinguished from, let's say, what might be done in computer science with a machine learning approach or something similar. But what we're going to do is we're first going to try to build a dynamical model that helps us understand how what we call inputs, what components to the system or exogenous effects, contextual effects, how they affect outcomes of interest. Okay, so we're going to obtain these models from data using concepts of system identification, and we're going to have to design an experiment to support that. And we may rely on behavioral theories to be able to help us come up with good dynamical models. And then once we have that dynamical model, then we come up with a decision algorithm, decision rules. Okay, we also, I guess, call this a controller that use that model to be able to then make decisions on optimal dosages over time, given measurements of outcomes and other effects. These things are normally called tailoring variables. And then there's many different kinds of algorithms to do control, and I'm going to talk specifically about model predictive control. Okay, so let me talk a little bit further about some of the interventions that I alluded to at the beginning of the talk. The first one is the Just Walk study, which was done while Eric Hekler was here at ASU, in which we now have a Just Walk version 2 that we just got recently funded. And the idea is to get basically sedentary middle-aged adults to be able to walk more. Okay, and this was a relatively small trial, and we did experimentally try some of the system identification component, but now with the new grant, we'll have the opportunity to do the full COT. Okay, basically in this intervention, the idea is that we're looking at steps per day, and then also looking at some other behavioral outcomes. And there's two things that we can manipulate. One are the daily step goals, and then the other is expected points that the participant may receive if they meet the daily goal. Okay, and those expected points, once they accumulate a certain number of points, I think 500 points, and they can get an Amazon gift card. Okay, and then the goal is ultimately to take the participant to 10,000 steps a day. Now, in the big picture of things, what we want to be able to get when we sort of close the intervention loop, and you can see here, it shows the entire the feedback pattern of measurement, the desired goal, which is the set point, and the manipulations that are done, the measurement, the activity, and then the measurement, which is then fed to the decision algorithm. This is in essence a health coach of sorts that is being carried out by the closed loop system. And then, of course, there is a model, dynamical model that we wish to obtain from our participants that is part of what this decision algorithm carries out. And by the way, I'd like to acknowledge that these are the daughters of Cesar Martin. He was in the earlier photo on the Just Walk team. He's a professor now at he did a PhD here at ASU, and now he's a professor at the Espol School in Guayaquil, Ecuador. And his dissertation was integral to this work. Okay, so this here is the big picture view of the COT, or what we call the control optimization trial. It starts out with a system identification test, okay, which in itself is not necessarily an optimized intervention. We take the participant from a baseline. In this case, this is being illustrated for steps per day in the Just Walk intervention. So we create a systematic set of intervention to learn more about how the participant responds to change. Okay, and because this will take the participant to a level beyond the baseline, it does have beneficial effects. From this, we build a model, and then we commission the controller, and the controller then accomplishes both initiation, which is trying to take the participant to the 10,000 steps per day, coupled then by once we are close to the objective 10,000 steps per day, then it switches into a maintenance mode where it basically doesn't need to intervene as often unless there are conditions that motivate having to for example, provide rewards again to the participant, or otherwise stimulate the individual to create change to return back to the desired goal. Okay, and this is the big picture of the COT. It's this combination of the identification test to get data and to get a model, coupled with the controller commissioning. Okay, so how do we achieve that system identification experiment? Well, and again, we in this approach, we are very keen on being able to provide systematic change. And I have this quote here from Box, Hunter, and Hunter that I ran into a few years ago, that to find out what happens when you change something, it is necessary to change it. So in this case, you can see that for both of the things that we are manipulating, which is the daily goals and then also the available reward points, these are adjusted using what's called a multi-sign input. Is sort of pseudo-random in nature. So the goal is that as far as a participant is concerned, they appear to be random changes. But these are well designed to give us information about the over a particular, again, there's a frequency domain interpretation for this, which is part of control engineering. There's a very systematic way of creating change. Again, this is one of a number of different signals that could be used for this purpose. You could also use random signals if necessary. And these are, periodic, and we put them cycle per cycle. And normally, we try to make the test long enough so that we get an acceptable trade-off between bias and variance. And we know that we're not going to get perfect models, but we want to have models that are good enough so that then they can be used for the controller commissioning step. Okay. Now, in terms of actually then estimating the dynamical model, once we have data, we have different ways of going about it. So what I'm going to go do is I'm going to try to describe 3 approaches. One is to basically a black box, ready-made prediction error approach. And then I'm going to describe 2 mechanistic approaches that involve what we call semi-physical models, and these both rely on behavioral theories. Okay. So on the black box approach, and here I describe what's called the autoregressive with external input, or ARX, and these are one of a family of modeling approaches that are available, and a lot of time series analysis tools. They're available in MATLAB and the system identification toolbox. And what we're doing here is we have sampled measurements of the different outcomes of interest and the inputs that we manipulated, the components that we manipulate, and then other external variables that we may measure. Okay, and we just do linear regression in this particular case for the ARX model to get a model. We use statistical techniques of cross-validation. We can use index. I will cite here this fit index measure, and I have an illustration from one of our Just Walk participants. So you can see here the manipulations done by the multi-signs. This is the actual behavior. These are some other external influences, such as predicted busyness, predicted stress, and predicted typical, which the participants entered through the Just Walk app, whether the day was a weekday or a weekend. And because these are sort of periodic signals, we can sort of mix and match when we do the estimation and validation. Again, using pretty routine statistical thinking and mindset. And so far we haven't really used any prior knowledge on these. Again, they're black box type models with a ready-made structure. But what we can do, though, is if we look over a collection of participants, we can then just get a sense for how different variables in the problem affect the particular, and get a sense for that individual variability or that individual idiosyncrasy that I alluded to at the beginning of the talk with the cartoon. And again, we talk about this in more detail in the chapter, but we basically see if introducing a particular component, a particular measurement into the model allows an improvement in the fit, and whether it does so for the overall fit or for the validation fit. And then from this, we can characterize whether participants, in this case, I have 3 examples here, one that is stress affected, one that's a weekday, weekend walker, because that variable improves the fit a lot, and then a goal-driven one that it doesn't matter what's going on, that person basically tries to follow the goals. Okay, so that's one approach. Okay, now if we want to think in terms of things that are informed by theory, let me then call your attention to the gestational weight gain problem and to the healthy mom zone intervention that Daniel Downs and Jen Savage have been involved in developing at Penn State. Okay, and here again, there are a number of intervention components, and ultimately the goal is to provide certain levels of dietary and physical activity education and prescription, which can be augmented over time based on the participants' needs. Okay, and there's again a lot of intensive data collection. Now here, in the overall schematic of this problem, okay, what you have is you have energy balance, which is well understood, and we have energy balance models that are geared to pregnant women, and they form part of the model. And then on the behavioral side, we use the theory of planned behavior. And by the way, it is possible in this field to mix and match kind of theories. We take into account self-regulation, and which is also a theoretical concept that is well accepted. But what I want to explore here is the theory of planned behavior and how that ends up being part of our dynamical system model. Okay, and One of the great opportunities I had, and thankful for Linda Collins, who was my mentor in my K-25 years ago, also for Liz Janexi, who was a program officer at NIDA, and was very instrumental and very helpful. And this, allowed me the opportunity to do a lot of training and have protected time and the likes. And back then, one of the things that we ended up figuring out is that we could take, a path diagram. If you have a theory that has a path diagram, which the theory of planned behavior does, and this comes from structured equation modeling, we figured out how we could translate any path diagram into a corresponding fluid analogy. And the fluid analogy basically allows us to take all the important constructs of the problem and consider them as tanks with inventories that can either increase or decrease based on the actions being done by the intervention or by external effects. Okay, and as I said, we could take literally any path diagram. We know how to write it into a set of equations, and this is just for the sake of illustration. This is my busiest math slide in the entire talk. We can, come up with a set of differential equations which has parameters we can then estimate. And this is the kind of thing that if you run into any control systems engineer, whether it be chemical engineering like me, electrical engineering like Professor Lagoa at Penn State, or mechanical engineers, they will immediately recognize the usefulness.
Excuse me. They will recognize the usefulness of having a system of equations.
And the fact that when you have then intensive data, intensive measurement, this can be used to build a model. Okay. Now, this diagram here, now what I want you to keep in mind is that anytime we have these fluid analogies, there's a corresponding set of equations. And here what I show is for the conceptual problem that was, or the conceptual structure, I'm showing basically all the corresponding fluid analogies that relate to the energy balance, the energy intake TPV model, and then the decision rules. And that's what this picture shows here. And again, there's a set of equations that comes out of that, which we can then try to estimate into a model. I have an illustration here of the from the Healthy Mom Zone, and this is an illustration of how we fit the physical activity theory of planned behavior model using data. This is actual participant data. Okay, and you can see here the corresponding fits. We had to do a little bit of smoothing, and then the corresponding fit indices, which are actually rather nice. And when it comes to any theoretical framework, I mean, you don't have to pick every construct. You can just recognize which constructs are most important. It may be that depending on the problem you're working on, certain constructs don't necessarily show any significant variation. And but needless to say, this is a model that helps us understand change, and then will then inform the decision framework later on. Now, let's say you're in a setting where you're thinking, well, we really don't have a nice path diagram, but we sort of have a particular theoretical framework in mind, and we know how this can benefit us. And such was the case for our team back, just almost getting close to 10 years ago, when we embarked on wanting to represent social cognitive theory in terms of a dynamical systems model, in terms of a fluid analogy. And SET is very widely regarded in terms of understanding health behavior, but there's, to my knowledge, there's no good path diagram out there. At least we didn't get to find one. So what we came up with, and we have this documented in a series of papers, including one in translational behavioral medicine, and then a very recent one that is in the IEEE Transactions and Control Systems Technology, is through a team science approach, a collaboration of behavioral scientists and engineers. We just sort of hashed out this fluid analogy for social cognitive theory with all the important constructs And as I said earlier, when you look at this set of tanks here, imagine the fact that there's going to be a system of equations that describes it, which we can then try to fit to intensive longitudinal data. Okay, so now normally when we work with teams and try to get people to use these approaches, we try to get if they don't have a path diagram, we try to have them write things in some kind of reasonable representation that can then be translated into a fluid analogy. So here I've taken the liberty to show. I had these documents and these scans lying around from when we first worked on this, and Bill Riley from OBSSR was involved in this effort, and he's sort of really liked the idea of the fluid analogies and seeing the value. So this was back when we started. This was his first diagram on what he thought that SET represented, and in the process again of discussion, collaboration, and refinement, you can see that I don't think it took him a year, but because everybody's busy, you can see here that a little over a year later, he's sort of writing his own fluid analogies. Okay, so that's the process that we normally try to do with groups when we work with them, is try to get them to articulate what they think are the important effects, try to get them to think in terms of time, try to get people to not think nomothetically, respectively, and that way, ultimately get them to a point where you can get a result that then is amenable to the dynamical systems approach. And here I just offer this for the sake of just for the benefit of our listeners, that after we were all said and done, and we have this in the TBM paper, we actually could, in hindsight, come up with a path diagram. So this was a path diagram arrived from the fluid analogy after the fluid analogy had been completed. So this is available in the TBM paper and available for the community to use. Okay, now our effort in the new R01 for the Just Walk version 2 is to try to validate try to do as much validation or as we can, or unfalsification of the SET model. And we were able to do some of it in the first Just Walk. So this shows an illustration here of a subset of the SET model involving behavioral outcomes, and self-efficacy. And then this, I show here data for the participant I had indicated before that shows how this semi-physical model. So before I had illustrated a black box model that used the autoregressive with external input structure that was a black box structure, and now here we have a semi-physical structure to try to model this participant. And again, that's our challenges for the future are to be able to understand that SET model, improve it, refine it as necessary, because ultimately these approaches are a way of getting started. Now, I've said a lot about modeling, and modeling is critical to the control optimization trial. Getting a good model, and of course, in the things that are associated with getting a good model, which is having adequate measurement and the like. Nothing has to be perfect, but you do have to be able to see change and see change reflected in the measurements. And now let me talk about the controller part. So we have our model. Now we have our controller, and in our controller, it has to have the following functional requirements. It has to consider multiple outcomes. It has to decide on potentially multiple intervention dosages. The next item here is from control system lingo, which is it has to both feed back, as you saw with the health coach, but it also has to feed forward if there is something that's anticipated, if there is the possibility that the participant will be undergoing stress, or the weekend is coming up or something similar, that knowledge of a future event influences the current decision making. It has to handle constraints. okay, because our intervention dosages and are going to have limits. And then it also has to manage potentially discrete value dosages that might be only in particular increments and also might be in a particular sequence. So this we do with what's called model predictive control. And model predictive control is an approach for doing control that involves a real-time optimization algorithm. It's been around for quite a while, and since the 70s, and now it gets used by engineers in many fields. It used to be more the domain of chemical engineers. Now it gets used by electrical, mechanical, and in all sorts of problems. And the interesting thing about the predictive control is, as I show in this diagram here, you're trying to make decisions about future values of your dosages and your intervention. And the future of your outcome is dependent on two things. It's dependent upon activities in the past, which you can't do anything about. And then it's also going to be dependent on those settings of the dosages that you set for the future, whose effect you can determine from a model. And then you could also have what I call here forecasted disturbance. That you could, if you happen to know that there's going to be a stressful day coming up, or a weekend, or something similar, that can be incorporated. And basically, the algorithm using optimization, in this case, what's called quadratic programming, makes decisions on the future dosages by trying to take this future prediction based on the model to a desirable target. And again, incorporating what could be future anticipated events. And it does this at every decision point, and that's what's called moving horizon implementation. And that's all formalized in terms of an optimization algorithm that tries to take things to goal and then also tries to minimize this variability in the intervention dosages and also keep them within constraints. So in the case of the Just Walk, this shows that we can then use this to decide on the goals and the expected points. This is a little bit more enhanced picture than the one that I showed before by the fact that now the decision algorithm, the controller, and it's a hybrid, we call it a hybrid model predictive controller because usually these intervention dosages are going to be in discrete levels. Okay, and then this year now I finally, for the first time in this presentation, I'm showing a simulated result. Everything that I had shown thus far has been on data, real data. And here you can see that that we go from the baseline to try to improve the, giving essentially nudging the participant to ambitious but doable goal. And the goal setting is adjusted by the controller, also the number of points that could be available points. The actual granted points are shown here. Once you get close to the target, then you can go on a maintenance mode. If for some reason some environmental effect occurs, then you can reinstate the controller to activate both components. And this is the nature, again, of the model predictive controllers, doing this moving horizon optimization, relying on the model that we identified before, taking into account constraints and the like. And then the full cut, which is the picture that I showed earlier. What I showed earlier was just this bottom panel, but now here it's shown in the context of both the identification test, which is how we basically get the variability we need so we can get a model, then the controller commissioning, and the maintenance. This is the full cut, that combination of system identification with the controller design and implementation. And this is what in Just Walk version 2, we want to be able to accomplish. Okay, this is what we want to be able to do, and to be able to do this for a large number of participants. Now, this is Just Walk is a physical activity intervention, and people are where again it's easy to do the varying of goals and the like. In the healthy mom zone, where we're dealing with pregnant women and limited time to do things, and clearly limitations on what we can intervene on. But in the case of the healthy monzone, what the controller is doing is basically deciding whether to augment or decrease a particular component. Okay, and this is illustrated as a series of step-ups that have to occur in the sequence. And the nice thing about the predictive controller is that we can use propositional logic to be able to carry out the sequence. Okay, and that gets incorporated in the algorithm. So here I have an illustration, and again, this is also in simulation, but this is being accomplished with the model that I estimated before. I'd shown before some models that had come from data, and what I want you to notice is if you contrast the predictive controller to, let's say, a simple set of if-then rules to accomplish the change, what is critical about the predictive controller is that it starts intervening earlier because it has a dynamical model that gives it a forward-looking sense of the effect. So what you can see here, you can see in the blue that the participant under the predictive control is able to stay within the target better, and the simple if-then or the basic if-then rule, eventually that participant is going to be outside the targets. And a reason for it is that you can see that the actions of the predictive controller are going to be more appropriate, more just in time. Okay, this again shows now the COT concept, which would be in the context of this problem, what we would do is we would introduce a series of changes before the controller is commissioned. These series of changes, augmentations are provided so that we can get the data to get a dynamical model, and then we can commission the controller. So, we're still doing we need to do some additional development work on the HMC, and we're, again, looking into a new grant for that. And for the R01, for the Just Walk version 2, we are we have this new grant that I've mentioned before. We do have a clinical trial with almost 400 participants planned. And here I'm going to borrow a term that Eric Hekler, my colleague, has been using a lot, which is the use of intelligent iterative triangulation to achieve success. Because clearly what we're doing with the COT is one approach, but then there's so many areas that we can draw from, right? And those areas include, things like machine learning. So I mentioned in the abstract for the talk that I would just briefly talk about how does this all relate to machine learning. And first of all, machine learning is a very vast field with many different topics. So there's some overlap. And reinforcement learning is probably the closest parallel to what we do in control systems engineering. But I want to make clear that there's no hostilities between the fields. In fact, in a normal control conference, when you have sessions on building machine learning aspects into control design, they're usually pretty full, and there's a lot of interest and attention to that in activities and even dedicated conferences to this topic. And what I would like you, though, to keep in mind is that, normally in the pure kind of reinforcement learning, machine learning approach, you start with very little assumptions and you learn, right? You work towards learning what you need after you make your adjustments. And there's, different terminology that gets used. What I want you to consider then in the things that I've described, we rely on behavioral theory to define model structure. So take advantage of that a priori knowledge. We are very systematic about our experimental design. I illustrated the multi-signs. You can also use steps. You could also use what are called pseudorandom binary sequences. And then ultimately, when you commission the controller, you don't need a perfect model. You need one that is good enough. And that what makes for a good enough model depends on the performance characteristics of that you want for your closed loop system. So I guess I will. I do want to allow time for questions. Hopefully, through what I've discussed in the last 50 minutes, you've gotten a sense that that this field of control engineering has a value, and you've gotten a sense for this control optimization trial, which is basically that connection of the system ID and the control design to be used in an idiographic single subject setting. as something that could be very beneficial to a wide class of problems. And I'd like to acknowledge a number of the sponsors and also all the different students that have been here at ASU. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera. There are a number of questions. One of the questions I like to ask with a topic like this is how NIH study sections respond to applications that propose these methods. Have NIH study sections
David, I am unable to hear you, so I don't know. I've had that problem from the beginning. Okay, let me see if I can look in the chat and I can see the questions. Okay. Have NIH study sections been supportive of applications that propose these methods, or have they faced challenges because the methods are new and unusual? Yes, that is a tough question because, we did, from the Just Walk version 1 to the Just Walk version 2, we went through a number of iterations. And I think that there's usually what my experience has been is that the methods per se are not a problem, and things have to be articulated in a way that convinces reviewers that that these are meaningful interventions. Okay, and I think that what we're doing right now with the with the Just Walk version 2, I mean, we will have a clinical trial associated with it, with control and intervention and some of the things that you would expect on a clinical trial. That does create challenges for us in terms that we have to, as part of our research agenda, make come up with approaches that allow us to get these models in a relatively automated manner. But I would say that you still have to have, after all said and done, an intervention that convinces the group. And I don't think the methods per se have been an obstacle. Okay, and I'm going to try something here. Maybe. Okay. Oh, hold on one second. I know that I see the question, but let me see if I can just maybe if I get out of my.
I don't know if this is going to allow me to hear people better.
Are you able to hear me, Dr.
Now I can. Now I can. I don't know. It must be that the WebEx is not. My earphones got in the way. Now I can hear.
Okay, so the next question was, what suggestions do you have for researchers who are interested in this method, this topic, as far as finding and developing collaborations with others who already have experience with the methods, whether it's at their home institution or elsewhere?
Yeah, well, that this is an issue that, in fact, I was part of an activity a couple of weeks ago where I sort of suggested that. See, normally in whether it be electrical, mechanical, chemical, also computer science, you're going to have people that are control systems experts, and either sort of reaching out to their department chair or maybe reaching out to a dean for research. Or a dean for an engineering dean for research, and just saying, hey, look, I am doing this work. Is there somebody that you could bring my attention to? And that would be my my recommendation, is to do that kind of outreach. I think that one thing that makes things a lot better now than what they were back in, when I first started, there's a lot more literature, so you can certainly put attention to the things that we've written. You can call attention to the things that have been written at Penn State with David Conroy. Again, I mean, we have worked with Penn State too with Daniel Downs and Jen Savage, but there's Dave Conroy, Constantino Lagoa that have some work. So those would be ways in which I would reach out to folks.
One of the questions that we had was, you've actually already addressed, would you ever recommend conducting an RCT after a COT? So what are you going to get out of the RCT that you haven't gotten out of the COT?
No. The COT, because it's an idiographic type of test, it's only telling us how it works within a single participant. And it just I think that in general medicine or behavioral medicine, you want to understand multiple participant response. So as part of our Just Walk version 2, we do have a smaller trial that is meant to work out some of the technology aspects and some of the method aspects and the like, but it's only about maybe 20, 30 participants. So right. I think we need something that shows that this is sort of more widely applicable. And I think in the process too, because it's a larger group, we'll also learn how to do these things faster.
Yeah, this brings the question of how do we go to scale with something like this? So a lot of public health interventions involve thousands of participants, not 20 or 10 or maybe even 350. So if the identification test period has to be done separately for each participant, how do we do this on a larger scale?
Well, that's again depending on the problem, the nature of the problem. And in fact, this is something that we've wanted to do for the Healthy Mom Zone, is that we're looking at our phase 1 and phase 2 data and recognizing possible common characteristics so that we don't have to do a full-blown identification. And again, it depends on the problem space, but I think that in its in its conceptual form and in its an initial form that we've been describing, we've been looking at these individual tests. But it may be that you don't need to look at every component individually, and that is part of the research.
We have time for maybe another question or two. You showed us a number of path models and talked about how to go from a path model to an intervention model. What if the team that comes to you or to another expert hasn't got the path model worked out? Is that something that has to be done before they can move ahead?
I think and I think that's what I tried to illustrate with the social cognitive theory, is that in fact, I've worked with a number of individuals that, what I tell them is try to come up with something that's a reasonable facsimile, right? So it doesn't have to be 100% certified SEM path model, but what it hopefully is some kind of diagram that helps to understand the course over time. I think that's sort of critical, is to be able to recognize, well, this is what's happening over time, and not to think so much nomothetically. And then it's always an iterative improvement process, because it ultimately informs what's going to be measured and what could potentially be adjusted. Normally, too, we ask people to not think necessarily at first, is this a measurable construct or not, but worry about that later. Just try to see something that describes what could be the course of the phenomenon, and then we can take it from there.
What if the variables that we care about have a lot of noise? Isn't that going to be a problem for this kind of?
Noise can always be problematic, but it's not a deal breaker. And it depends on the character of the noise. It could be a very high frequency noise. It could be filtered out, and the main dominant effect is still seen. So, there's filtering approaches that are part of control systems engineering that could potentially be used. So with so just want to be careful. I don't want to say that any type of noise can be handled, but noise is not a deal breaker. It's not a threat to the approach.
Spoken like an engineer. Spoken like an engineer. Any problem is really just an opportunity, and you have to figure out a solution for Dr. Rivera, it's been a great talk. I'm sorry we didn't get to nearly all the questions. We have a lot of them. We will send you a list of questions that we haven't been able to get to. Would encourage you to provide short answers, and then we can post that information on the website when we post the webinar videocast and the slides. You've had a good audience today. Very attentive. I want to thank you very much, and I will turn it back to Astrid to close us out.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, and thank you, Dr. Rivera. Thank you to everyone who participated in today's webinar. As I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we will be posting the slides and a recording of today's session on our website next week. You will receive an email with the link to the recording when it is available. Thank you.